Good afternoon, everyone. Uh, I have no words. We keep doing this. It's been almost 2 years, and we're almost saying the same things, almost the same exact things for 2 years. This is Teaching Palestine Today, and I am very delighted to be joined by a colleague and a professor, a researcher, and much more. Professor Yousef Munayyer, who will address the topic of Zionism on the on this broadcast. We will be watching the commentary by several people on the question of Zionism, about 5 to 7 minutes each, and then Yousef will provide his commentary. And much of this is geared towards learning about Zionism, teaching Zionism, and certainly for pedagogical purposes. Ahlan wa sahlan, Yousef. All
Ahlan,
right.
Bassam. Thanks for having me.
Hello. Before I start by asking you some very basic questions, before we get into the videos, let me just share a little bit about you, Yousef. No bio does justice to anyone, actually. Nonetheless, Yousef Munayyer is head of Palestine Israel program and senior fellow at Arab Center in Washington, D.C. He also serves as a member of the editorial committee of the Journal for Palestine Studies and was previously executive director of the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights. He teaches classes on Palestine in Washington, D.C., in the Washington, D.C. area, actually. And some of his published articles can be found in the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Nation, Boston Globe, Foreign Policy Journal of Palestine Studies, Middle East Policy, and others. Dr. Munayyer holds a PhD in international relations and comparative politics from the University of Maryland. Um, Yousef, I know that by now it's almost redundant, almost whatever we say, and we are watching our screens in disbelief. Nonetheless, today's episode is on Zionism. Teaching Palestine Today is a pedagogical series, and today's episode is on Zionism. It's produced by the project Gaza and Context Collaborative Teach-In Project, and with a lot of co-sponsors, including the network PARN, um, which actually at the end of the show I'll list all of the co-sponsors. For now, Yousef, how have you been doing?
Hanging in there. I suppose. Okay. Obviously, following everything that we are seeing on the ground with absolute horror. But this has somehow become our lives over the last several years. Um, and I'm glad that you guys are hosting these important conversations, and I'm very happy to be a part of that today.
Thanks, Yousef. Before we basically watch the commentary on Zionism by several experts on the topic, would you like to share anything that is by way of an update, given that this was a 1 year on project which took place a few months ago? And nonetheless, the topic is actually quite constant, which is Zionism. It's not an event. Is there anything you'd like to say before we begin featuring these commentaries?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I appreciate the prompt. What have we learned about Zionism over this time? As I sat down to think about it, I think what I would say is I don't think we've learned a whole lot, to be honest. Um, is what we are seeing Israel do in Gaza today absolutely horrifying and shocking to the human soul? Of course. Should we really be surprised? I would argue no, not if we've been paying attention. Zionism has always sought the replacement of Palestinians. That is the intention, right? There are lots of different ways to accomplish this. You can make life difficult for people under apartheid and press them to leave over time. You could carry out mass ethnic cleansing, put people on buses, drive them from their homes at gunpoint, as we saw many different stages in the history of this confrontation, or you can commit genocide. All of these actions exist along a spectrum of replacement. So, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised that we are seeing genocide being used in Gaza today. Shock? Yes, because we're human, and that is a natural human reaction to the horrors that we are witnessing on a day in and day out basis. But not surprised, because everything that we've seen prior to this leads up to this. I would argue that the genocidal violence that we see today is the product of several things. Intent, which we've already discussed. I believe it is the intent of Zionism to replace Palestinians in the land. And I think, we'll have opportunity to talk further about sort of how we teach these things and how we learn about these things. And I think some of the most instructive ways to do that is to really listen to and read what Zionists have said over time about their intentions. The other component is opportunity. And we have seen time and time again when there is an opportunity for Zionism to enact mass displacement, ethnic cleansing, huge land grabs, and in this case, genocide. They've often taken those opportunities. The other component is power disparity, and of course, there is a tremendous power disparity between the Israeli military and the Palestinians, no matter what sort of fight they're able to muster. And the fourth component, which I think is particularly important in this situation, especially as it relates to the ability to commit genocide, is impunity. And impunity is something that has been practiced. It's something that has been expanded by Israel over time. And it is a key component that allows them to make the decision to carry this out, because they believe largely that they're going to be able to get away with it. And that is a lesson that they've learned over time, because they've been able to largely get away with far smaller crimes in comparison to the crime of genocide. But again, none of this, I think, should really have surprised us. I think what we learned more about in relation to Zionism wasn't so much about the political ideology itself, but about the extent to which others were willing to sacrifice in support of it, and specifically the United States, Israel's key ally and supporter. The United States has paid a massive amount for Israel's genocidal war, just in terms of money alone. I think there was a study by the Watson Institute over at Brown University last year that found that through that point, that was in 2024, through that point in Israel's genocidal war, the United States had already picked up the tab for something like 70% of the war costs. This is an American-financed war. It's not just a war that is backed by American diplomatic support, American military support, American intelligence and logistical support, but it's financed by the American taxpayer in a very, very significant way. The United States at the disposal of protecting Israel so that it can continue this genocidal war. The extent to which the United States has been willing to put its military assets at the disposal of a foreign nation, particularly in the context of Israel, is unprecedented. We've never seen something like that before. Further, the U.S. has not only maintained double standard towards the so-called rules-based order that it otherwise trumpets. It has attacked that very order for the sake of protecting Israel's genocidal war. We see this with U.S. attacks on the United Nations and United Nations employees. We see this with U.S. attacks on aid agencies, including UNRWA and others. We see this with U.S. attacks on the International Criminal Court, which, of course, it's happy to support when it targets war criminals of a darker complexion than Israeli leaders. But when it comes to holding Israeli leaders accountable, the United States not only opposes this, but is actively getting involved in targeting and punishing prosecutors at the court itself, and those who would assist the court in seeking accountability. Further, we've seen the United States actually go after some of its own allies for daring to hold Israel to account for anything that it is doing in Gaza. We've seen this with South Africa. We've seen this with Ireland, and this is something that that continues. And I think perhaps most importantly, not only is the United States lashing out beyond its borders at friendly institutions and countries alike in support of Israel's genocidal war, it's also lashing out internally at the very constitutional rights that define American identity because of support for Israel's genocidal war against Palestinians in Gaza. We are seeing unprecedented attacks on the First Amendment. We are seeing protesters being rounded up by federal agents. We are seeing an attack on the American educational system. One of the really amazing and excellent exports that the United States has to the world is its higher education system. And our own government is attacking that education system in an unprecedented way because it seeks to continue to provide cover for Israel's genocidal war. So I think there is not a whole lot that I've learned about Zionism over the last couple of years, but I think the extent to which the United States has been willing to go to the point where it is self-destructive for the United States in unprecedented ways to support Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. I think that is something that has been surprising and that has taught us a lot about the United States as well.
Indeed. And maybe so much so, I was going to call you Omar. I have no idea why. Maybe so much so, Yousef, in terms of the point you're stressing about the U.S. involvement in a way that sabotages itself. It's happening so much so, or it is a reality to the point where unusual suspects have come out from the least likely places to actually say, what is going on? This is not, I mean, and these are people that are you and I and so many of people in our circles who support, for instance, social justice and various forms of anti-racism and basically the way we critique Islamophobia and anti-Semitism and classist and culturalist discourses. These folks are the target of our critique in the past, and they have come out and said, this is unfathomable what the US is doing, and it's actually destroying this concept of the US first or America first. So it's indeed strange. I'm going to go on and feature the commentary by 7 scholars and researchers, and I'll just name them, even though they will appear very clearly on the video. Mokhiber, Lana Tatour, Nimer Sultany, Adam Horowitz, Noura Erakat, Sami Al-Arian, and Sherene Seikaly, in no particular order, except that this is the order in which you will see the commentary. So buckle up, and right after we will ask you, Yousef, if you have any comments on what you have heard in total or individually, with an eye to teaching Palestine, or teaching, in this case, Zionism. Here we go.
Okay, 5 minutes to cover 100 plus years of this political ideology. Well, I mean, it's funny that conversations around the issue of Zionism have been so constrained for so many years, and I think we all know why that is. You're talking about basically a kind of heretical product of fundamentalist Christian cults in the UK and the US long before Jewish European colonialists like Herzl picked up the idea of Zionism, and it's something that's always been hotly debated. It's only in recent years that censorship in countries across the West, in particular, has gotten so strong as to try to silence even a discussion about Zionism. It's not a mystery. Modern political Zionism is just European settler colonialism. It's not a concept that was invented by Herzl or even by Christian Zionists who came before him. And it's a particular model of European settler colonialism, which is a kind of subgenre of white supremacy that's known as Jewish supremacy. It is very zealously defended by the West as their last remaining colony. And it's the only political ideology you're not allowed to criticize. You can criticize democracy and capitalism and communism and socialism and anarchism, and there's any other political ideology in the world you are allowed to criticize in Western countries. The only one where you can be punished for criticizing a political ideology is Zionism. And I think the outlawing of criticism of political Zionism in the West that's happening now is proof of their fear that they are unable to defend this ideology on moral grounds. Because the minute you begin to unpack it, you see good old-fashioned, bad old-fashioned, white supremacist settler colonialism. And I think the other thing that we've learned about this particular political ideology is that it's not only destructive in Palestine, and it's not only destructive in the broader Middle Eastern region, but it's proven to be highly destructive of institutions and norms in the West. It has corrupted governments, it has corrupted media corporations that have had to swear allegiance to this particular political ideology. It has created a new McCarthyism that stretches beyond the United States into other countries of the West. And even the sacred cow in the US of so-called free speech or the First Amendment is being willingly slaughtered in defense of Zionism now in the US. So you can see the danger of this kind of political ideology, not just to the frontline victims who are being colonized in Palestine, but in some sense to all of us. But I think as an international human rights lawyer, what I can probably say with absolute certainty is that this is a political ideology that is fundamentally inconsistent with the norms and standards of international human rights law, right? I mean, these norms reject colonialism, apartheid, racial hierarchies, systematic discrimination, inequality. This is the opposite of what the international human rights framework is supposed to represent. And it's not surprising. I mean, any settler colonialism practiced on Earth is by definition racist. If you want to establish a settler colony on the moon, maybe that would be an exception. But whenever you have to arrive at a place and you have to displace, erase, and replace the indigenous people, that is by definition a racist enterprise, a racist project. So it's not surprising that the UN actually adopted a resolution in 1975 saying that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, and that held for years until it was ultimately revoked in 1991 as a condition that Israel put forward for its participation in the Oslo process. But I think that when people look at this particular political ideology, they will very quickly understand why that resolution was passed in 1975. And I think we're moving back in the direction of recognizing this moral reality, because the International Court of Justice, they have ended this detour around Oslo that said that international law doesn't apply, human rights don't apply. We all have to negotiate for what rights are going to be tossed to the Palestinian people. And that has opened up a lot of doors. And we're already seeing now in the follow-up resolution in the General Assembly of the UN that they're talking about new anti-apartheid mechanisms that are on the way. There's a movement around the UN to reestablish the anti-apartheid mechanisms to confront Israeli apartheid. And I think that is encouraging. I think that they have overplayed their censorship hand and that the genie is out of the bottle now and it's not going back in.
Yeah, and so I was lucky enough to join you, I think, twice in this last year in talking about Zionism and questions of anti-Zionism. And I feel like, in terms of the topics we're talking about today, um, Zionism is really this topic that, for me, has become extremely clear in this last year and extremely clarified. Um, and by that, I mean, and this is still a conversation that might happen in some of the circles that we move in, or certainly some of the circles on the quote unquote left, or in the Palestine movement generally, around Zionism and questions of liberal Zionism and things like that. But I feel like one of the things the genocide in Gaza has really made clear, and not just in Gaza, but what we've seen throughout historic Palestine, what we've seen in Lebanon and the rest of the region, is just Zionism very clearly being acted out as a genocidal ideology that needs to be defeated. And one of the moments in this last year that helped clarify this for me, and it was really someone telling this to me, but so, I mean, I'm sure this is in my bio, we might talk about it. I'm managing editor at mondoweiss.net, which is a news website about Palestine and politics and movement around Palestine. And we ran an interview in March with Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta. And one of the things that he talked about in that interview was that one of the things that this is clarified for him is that Zionism is an ideology that needs to be defeated and will only end by being defeated. And I want to share one thing that he said, because I found it really interesting, and I've thought about it ever since. And he was sharing it as part of a critique of the Palestinians and Palestinian leadership. And he said, you see, the ANC was prepared to negotiate on everything other than the dismantlement of the ideology of apartheid. The failure of the Palestinians to centralize the destruction of Zionism as an ideology, without which there is no possibility of negotiation or coexistence, is now what we're paying the price for. It's a failure to accept the nature of the settler colonial ideology. And I remember when he said that in our interview, and I was really struck by it. But I do think that that is one thing that we have seen play out in this last year, because it's one of the things that we've really seen when we look at Israeli society, is this real consensus around this national project of Zionism, that for all of the disputes or conflict that might exist within Israeli society, there has really been a very clear consensus around the genocide in Gaza and the general militarism and Israel's role in the region. So for all these questions, and these are questions that still exist, that we see playing out on Twitter and in social media around Zionism and what its role is, I think one of the things this year has really clarified is ultimately that Zionism is an ideology that will have to be defeated before we're able to move on from this moment very fully.
One of the things that we've learned is that Zionist is not just settler colonial, that Zionist is not just apartheid, it's not just racial, that Zionism is all of the above and now has come to the extreme end of genocide. But I think so Zionism has been really revealed in ways that I think were less apparent in the international sphere. And maybe I'll explain what I mean by that. So I think one of the significant things that have happened in the last year is that we're actually seeing the recentering of critique of Zionism as the core issue in the road for Palestinian liberation. So Palestinians have always spoke about Zionism as a settler colonial and as a racial and racist movement. But what we are seeing now, and we had a moment in history, especially in the 60s and 70s, with the Third World Liberation Movement, where there was this kind of international recognition within the space of third world kind of liberation of this movement of Zionism, as part of this global imperial and colonial racism. So you would see continually statements that it is that we are fighting for liberation and against apartheid, against Zionism, against racism, against settler colonialism. And in the 80s and 90s, we kind of with the Oslo Accords, we saw these kind of critiques of Zionism in Palestinian political and intellectual tradition kind of subsiding a bit. But what we are seeing today is really, and we see that in the student movements in the United States and elsewhere around the world, in Europe, in Latin America, in other parts of the world, in Australia, we are seeing a centering of a critique of Zionism as questioning the legitimacy of this project. We see it in the mass protests globally. There is a conversation that is happening on the very nature of Zionism, and it's happening globally. And it may not happen at the level of governments, but it is happening at the level of movements, at the level of people. And this is really significant. Because the legitimacy of the Israeli state is the legitimacy of the Zionist project. And even though in the last, especially 15 years, we've seen more and more conversation on Israeli apartheid and Israeli settler colonialism, we've seen these conversations happening without really centering a critique of Zionism. And the Gaza moment has shown that you cannot speak about Palestinian liberation. You cannot understand the genocide without attending to the ideology, to the project that make it possible. So if in the 70s we had the resolution 3379 that determined that Zionism is a form of racism and racial discrimination, and here the work of Noura Erakat is really on the resolution is really significant. There was in our history this attempt to center in international law and international fora to really challenge this perceived legitimacy of the Zionist project. And then, of course, we lost this achievement in 1991, where the PLO agreed to rescind the resolution as preconditioning for entering the negotiations with Israel. But today we are seeing a return to really center Zionism and question its legitimacy. And this is significant because we can't be speaking about what is happening in Gaza. We can't speak about Palestinian liberation. We can't understand the question of Palestine without really understanding the Zionist project as a project that was born elsewhere, that was born in Europe, that was born in a context of imperialism and colonialism and racism and race science, and to question the legitimacy of the Israeli state and its actions in Gaza and the genocidal logics that it's clear that are underpinning its actions. We have to go back to Zionism and to challenge its legitimacy. And I think the last year, the genocide have centered back the question of Zionism and its legitimacy, or lack of legitimacy.
Well, I guess the best observation to say about Zionism is that we immediately saw, following the 7th of October, a kind of paradoxical development. On the one hand, there was an insistence, there was like different articles and such platforms as the Atlantic or the New Republic and other places that deny that Zionism is a colonial or a settler-colonial movement, and attack the students and the academics who use that kind of designation to describe and analyze Zionism. And on the other hand, there was an increase and intensification of the discourse of civilization, that Israel is acting as a Western or a European civilizing force, that the civilized are being attacked by the barbarians, and they are defending Western values against the barbarians, the children of light and the children of darkness, and that kind of discourse. So this is paradoxical, because the colonial discourse has always mobilized the discourse of civilization. It always justified the domination and the subjugation of the non-Europeans or Asians and Africans and Latin Americans more generally, because they were considered as uncivilized, because they were considered as barbarians or non-Christians, etc., or lawless. So at the same time, the pro-Zionists or the pro-Israelis were denying the colonial label. They were actually reenacting the very colonial logic that has led many of us to describe and analyze Zionism as colonialism. The second issue that we can say about Zionism is that the essence of Zionism has always been the territorial removal of the native population and the domination of that population by assigning it or the remnants of it as an inferior status. And given the fact that the native population is not likely to acquiesce in in its own disposition, the land grab, and the ethnic cleansing of this population from its own homeland, and it's not likely to acquiesce in inferior status, that they are unequal, there will be obviously resistance to this kind of colonial project, and that resistance becomes itself as an excuse or a justification for further infliction of violence. So what I'm trying to say is that the essence of Zionism leads to a dynamics in which the logical end is genocide. And that's what they have seen since the 7th of October. The Zionists have tried since 1948 in different ways to manage the population, the Palestinian native population. And there are many contingencies in history, but obviously at the end of this process, what we saw is that Zionism has developed into its logical end, which is that it cannot coexist with the native population. So now it is eliminating this population. And we see this in the logic that was invoked, that Israel is under existential threat or going through an existential war, because that's, again, an eliminatory logic that Israel uses in order to eliminate the native population. And we have seen that the choice that the Israeli army has inflicted on the Palestinians in Gaza and in southern Lebanon more recently is that it's a complete destruction of kilometers and kilometers of villages and towns. So the only way this colonial project can feel secure is through the elimination of all those who are living around it. And this is why Zionism and Israel in its current form cannot be accepted in the region, because it insists on the subjugation of its neighbors, specifically the Palestinians, and taking their lands. There's a lot of discussion about, one state, two state solution, but eventually all these discussions are a distraction, because the main question is Zionism willing to grant the Palestinians freedom and equality? And the answer is no. And so long as Zionism is not willing to grant equality, to treat the Palestinians on equal terms, it cannot be accepted because it is an ideology of Jewish supremacy and institutionalized racial discrimination. And the fact that Zionists now are insisting on collapsing the distinction between Zionism and Judaism makes it an existential struggle, and also reenacts this eliminatory logic. Because if my opposition to Zionism as a political project of supremacy, of domination, of subjugation, becomes, according to those who equate Zionism with Judaism, an objection to the very existence of Jews, then this becomes an existential struggle, because there is no distinction being made between political ideology and the religious or ethnic belonging. What we also saw is that once the dynamics of conflict between the colonizer and the colonized in Palestine is enacted, all the distinctions between right-wing Zionists and left-wing Zionists disappear. Because again, the essence of Zionism is, as many even Zionist historians have said, there's a built-in element of expulsion. So what they called transfer or ethnic cleansing or genocidal elements of the removal of the population and the destruction of the historic society of the Palestinians who lived in Palestine. So these distinctions between right-wing and left-wing disappear when this is considered as an existential struggle, and when it becomes clear that the natives will not accept anything less than equality and freedom. The final thing I would say about Zionism is that it has been unfortunately successful in two ways, as a matter of kind of global political opinion. One, they were successful in portraying falsely and ideologically the 7th of October attack by Palestinian organizations as an attack on all Jews in the world. And they were claiming repeatedly that this is an attack that resulted in the murder of most Jews since the Holocaust. Now, beside the fact that this is factually false, the fact that the category here is Jewish is again part of this collapse of the distinction in the Zionist worldview between Zionist and Jew, between Israel and the Jewish people, and obscuring the fact of colonial apartheid and brutal occupation that have subjugated the Palestinians for many decades. The second way in which Zionism has been successful in the West is that it has relied and mobilized racist discourse. So that includes Orientalism, that includes Islamophobia, that includes anti-Arab racism, and of course, anti-Palestinian racism. And we all have work to do in order to combat and challenge and deconstruct all these discourses that have helped legitimate and justify the genocidal war.
You know, I would say that unfortunately we haven't learned enough. I think that due to the anemic conversation around racism and colonialism, particularly in the United States, that it's the very topic that should be discussed and yet which has been avoided. And instead, there has been an attempt to collapse Zionism, a political movement and ideology that seeks to establish a settler sovereign in the place of a native Palestinian population where they already existed and sought to assert their self-determination as a political community, collapse with the identity of being Jewish in the world. And not only is that dishonest, but it's failing to have a conversation about what is the root cause of what we're seeing. Zionism, for most of us who study it and have tried to continue providing racial theory and colonial theory about it as a political ideology, as a intellectual and political bedfellow of apartheid, a similar kind of ideology. We have said in theory that the end goal of it, that it's taken to its logical conclusion, right, is a form of the complete erasure and removal of Palestinians. It is an unquenchable thirst, in the words of Fayez Sayegh, for land in order to continue expansion. It is the constant framing as ipso facto the Palestinian native as a security threat, regardless of whether or not they actually pose a threat to anybody, that their threat is that they just exist. And even though we have tried to show this in law and practice and the quotidian activities, right, of living under Zionist settler colonization, what we've seen right now is Zionism actually producing that logical end, right, that outcome, which is genocide. It's the erasure of Palestinians altogether. And it's that erasure with a righteousness to do so. It is an Israeli society that is debating the right to rape detainees. It is an Israeli society that is mocking Palestinians. It's an Israeli society that actually objects to any kind of sympathy for Palestinians or criticism of the government. It's a right to complete a genocide and what they think is necessary for their own self-defense. And it's a state that's doing so in their name using industrial weapons technology that is requiring the rest of the world to be suppressed politically in order to do what they're saying is getting the job done or finishing the job.
And so what we have seen about Zionism, right, is that the project, right, is done. It's Israel has failed as a project. Zionism has been has become bankrupt of any kind of moral thrust, and that's significant because Zionism historically was supported very much across broad spectrums of people at the United Nations by leading thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois, who understood it as a model for liberation of oppressed peoples. That's where it was functioning on some moral, gas. And here what we have in this moment is a complete moral bankruptcy, where no one is supporting Zionism from that place. Instead, there are very few people who are supporting it outright. And those who aren't, there would be more people protesting it if they weren't afraid of harassment, doxing, loss of gainful employment, or some sort of punishment.
And so one really, I think, illuminating example of this is in the way that AIPAC and even the ADL is operating. I mean, we see the ADL now unfurling programs across university campuses in order to support the universities in suppressing their student bodies. They are literally coordinating with modes of suppression in the name of protecting minorities. I mean, this is how morally bereft this project has become. But AIPAC used to basically wield a very quiet force in Washington and in halls of power, where now we see them wielding very explicitly their stick, not even just wielding their stick, but threatening their stick. That if you do not vote in this way, we can also undermine your political campaigns. So nobody is supporting AIPAC because they believe in, they believe in the right to continue to displace Palestinians, to remove them, to slaughter children who are placed in rice bags in order to be buried. You have people who are thinking very self-interested, I don't want to be punished. That's a moral bankruptcy. So AIPAC's interference, for example, in Cori Bush's campaign in Missouri, we see explicitly the institution pour $8.4 million to support her opposition. But note, with all that money, none of the ads that ran against Bush mentioned Israel. She was not defeated because of a support for Palestinian liberation. She was defeated on grounds that had to do with, the infrastructure bill, how she voted while in office, which indicates, again, that there's no moral cachet here. In that now moving forward, we see Zionism being mobilized from the top down as a form of coercive force, but not something that's generating sympathy and support naturally from those who are moved by sensibilities of justice. And that is in stark contrast to the way that the world has mobilized around Palestinian liberation.
Well, first of all, there is almost a consensus among serious scholars that the Zionist movement is a settler colonial movement. This may not have been obvious for some, but I think it's pretty clear right now through the history of over a century of what the Zionist movement did in Palestine and even before it got into Palestine. That's basically what it is. But it's much more than that. We've seen the Zionist ideology morph into being a racist, supremacist, very aggressive movement, expansionist movement. So when we look back at a century of Zionism, what it did to the Palestinians, to the displacement, dispossession of Palestinians, and what it did in Palestine in trying to present a dominant ethnic group, dominant culture, it's pretty clear what Zionism is about. But also the tragic part of Zionism, it redefined Judaism. And that's probably the most tragic part of Zionism. Zionism wants you to believe that Judaism is an ethnic group, or Jews are an ethnic group. They're a nationalist group. They are a tribe, so to speak, rather than as a revealed great religion. And by doing that, it actually furthered the tragic notion of anti-Semitism. A Zionist today is someone who believes or acknowledges or recognizes that Jews have a right in Palestine at the expense of the indigenous people of Palestine. Anybody who believes that they have a sovereign right to take a land from its people and give it to someone else who came from Europe or other places, basically is a Zionist. And they want to impose this reality to the point where Palestinians have absolutely no rights. They are expendable, so to speak. And the history of Zionism shows us that. Looking at the last year, even if these things were theoretical or people didn't see it, at least the current generations, now we see it vividly. That's what Zionism is doing. What they were doing in Gaza is genocide. This is not something that we hear about. This is not something that is a theoretical concept. This is something that Palestinians had to face for a full year. Tens of thousands of people were killed. Millions of people were uprooted. A whole city and culture have been basically erased, destroyed in Gaza. They're trying to do the same, invoke the same thing in the West Bank, in southern Lebanon. That's what Zionism has become. That's what people have seen, have witnessed, have experienced for a full year. So when we look at Zionism today and to see how tribal and how violent and how aggressive and how expansionist it is, then we know what it is. And I think the best person who described it way before even October 7th was Smotrich, the current finance minister, in which he says Palestinians basically have three options. And that's what we're going to tell them. They have one option is to totally recognize Israel as this state in Palestine. There is no Palestine. They would have to be subject at best, that they have to acknowledge this. They basically have to erase their history, heritage, and memory. And if they don't like it, and he acknowledges that most Palestinians will not agree to that, then they could be compensated and they could leave on their own. And if not, the only third option left to them is to be killed, to be eliminated. That's basically what he said. And he said it openly. He said it publicly. He did not hide it. He did not mince the words. He basically said that these are the options for the Palestinians. And when you look at what happened before October 7th, that's what the Palestinians were actually facing. So Zionism has defined itself not only as the enemy of the indigenous people in Palestine, but basically as an enemy to anyone who's going to stand up against their oppression, to stand up against what they have been doing to the Palestinians, ethnic cleansing and genocide.
I think, we've always known that ideology is dynamic and perpetually shifting and in conversation with the conditions around it. And similarly, we've known that since its inception, Zionism has had many internal tensions. One of those internal tensions that has informed both its form and content is, the question of its ambition. So was the ambition of Zionism, like some would claim, to be a light onto the nations, or was it to be a nation like any other? And I think that this tension between the exceptional and the common, like everybody else, is a kind of window onto this moment and what we've learned about Zionism in this last year, a moment in which we witness the consolidation of this explicit, prevailing, and ubiquitous extremism that characterizes Israel today, this kind of genocidal logic that I know Diana Buttu has really talked about in this series. And I think here I've been thinking a lot also about how we've come to understand liberalism and both its historical trajectory and in the moment we're living its crisis now. And I've been thinking about the insistence of some Zionist thinkers and founding figures and sort of their investment in individual rights and civil liberty, democracy, and how that insistence was from the very beginning in this mutually constituting relationship to settler colonial practice and theory. And here again is a kind of informing second tension of Zionism, which is that from the 1880s, with its first wave of settlement in Palestine, Zionism's kind of brand of liberalism, let's say, had always been contingent on exclusion, on the idea that some people were deserving of land, of nation, and of peoplehood, while other people were not. So this hierarchy of civilizational categories. And so Zionism's primary problem from its inception and I think this is what's changed. So its primary problem from its inception has been how to create a Jewish and democratic state in a land where most people were not Jewish. And so it seems now that in this moment of genocide, we might trace Zionism as a kind of case study, a laboratory of and in which ideas of the liberal and ideas of liberalism are kind of co-constituting with settler colonialism to shape forms of exclusion, extermination, and necro-political supremacy. And I think, with this last point, I think I was kind of just trying to survey, and preparing for today, and I was reminded of this group who set up a giant bouncy castle at the entrance where aid trucks were supposed to pass at Kerem Abu Salim, the crossing into Gaza this last summer. And the organizer of this celebration had urged others to kind of join the party. And, he sort of said, get ready, there will be inflatables, cotton candy, popcorn, plushies. And at around the same time, this last summer, we saw near Al-Khalil, near Hebron, Israelis attacking trucks of food coming from Jordan and heading to Gaza, a place that we know has been subject to a regime of starvation, Israeli starvation. And so We were witness to these scenes of, people throwing packages of food onto the road, ripping open bags of grain, setting trucks on fire. And I think these actions speak to the desire for more Palestinian death, more pain, more hunger, but they also broadcast the impunity and popularity of a genocide. And I'm thinking a lot about the spectacle of necro-political supremacy, and its relationship to the premises of liberalism in a settler colonial condition. So in this case, the spectacle of necro-political supremacy was so blatant that even U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had called it a total outrage.
That's a lot to take in, Yousef. Do you want a minute, a break, or do you want to plow through?
No, that's okay. I mean, I think obviously we heard a lot there um, from all of the different participants, but there are sort of two main areas of discussion that I kind of want to respond to that were present in many of the different comments. So themes that kind of kept coming up. And so I want to focus my sort of contribution here in these two areas. The first is as it relates to settler colonial analysis. Okay, Bassam, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in addition to those, I have a question for you at the end.
Yeah, of course. I hope we can have more discussion. But yeah, so first, as it relates to settler colonialism as a frame of analysis, and sort of what we have seen over the last couple of years, and how that speaks to the leverage that this frame of analysis offers us for understanding things. And a number of different people spoke about this. In fact, I think perhaps all of them spoke about this in one way or another. We heard, I want to say, it was from Craig earlier on, talking about how some of the initial conversation post October 7th in some of the mainstream spaces refuted this settler colonial analytical framework, and obviously shot down any criticism of Israel, harshly criticized the student protesters, and so on. And I think that one of the things that we need to grapple with when it comes to the settler colonial analytical frame is the retort. I mean, it's not often a serious retort, but it's a retort nonetheless. That within sort of settler colonial analysis, there is tremendous amount of leaning on sort of comparative analysis across different settler colonial cases. But one of the things that makes the Zionist case an outlier is the lack of a metric, right? In all of these other situations, you have a very clear metropole that is sort of driving settler colonial policy and process. And I think that it's important to address that and to address it in a way that is equally unique to the circumstances of this case. And I think, when we look at other historical cases, we often think about the metropole as the place of origin for the settler colonists. Right? This is where the settler colonists come from. And in the Israeli case, Zionists would argue, well, this is clearly not settler colonialism because we don't come from one particular place. This is actually an ingathering of a diaspora community that was originally from this location many thousands of years ago. And so it's not an applicable sort of comparison. But what I think needs to be more deeply conceptualized here, and I think it's on it's a responsibility on those of us within the community that that applies this settler colonial analysis, is to understand the metropole not merely as the place of origin for the settler community that carries out the settler colonial project, but rather as a power base from which the power disparity is generated so that settler colonialist processes can proceed successfully against the will of the native population. And I think when we understand the metropole in some way, in that particular way, there is a way to understand the Zionist diaspora, the constellation of different Zionist organizations, and the leverage with which those organizations are able to marshal power in other countries, both in the terms of shaping policy and generating resources that allow it to effectively act as a metropole in the way that a traditional metropole would, in terms of being able to generate the power necessary to impose the settler colonial process on the native population. And I think one of the things that has become so clear over the last 7 years, and this will lead me into the second point that I broadly want to make here, is the extent of the power that these institutions have within these other countries that allow them to effectively, as I said, shape policy and marshal resources to ensure that the settler colonial process not only continues, but can escalate to the point where we have reached genocidal violence, and it proceeds largely with impunity through this day. So we need, I think, a more crystallized conceptualization of how this works in the unique way in which it does. And perhaps there are some comparative cases here that one can lean on, thinking about sort of Liberia and so on. It's really not about whether or not the Zionist power base that is outside of Palestine is comparable to England or Belgium or France or what have you in these other examples, but whether or not it is able to generate an effective and significant enough power disparity vis-a-vis the native population to impose the settler colonial process against its will. And I think that is something that, particularly in this moment, deserves further investigation, further discussion. Because as a number of people have noted, and here's where I want to move into my second point, the extent to which pro-Israel interest groups, lobbies, organizations, communities, what have been able to wield power and influence today is more noticeable and objected to, I think, than any time before. And this has led to a moment that I think a number of people have commented on. I think Craig referred to sort of overplaying their hand. Noura talked about AIPAC becoming far more overt in their efforts. Laura talked about genocide forcing a recentering of Zionism's illegitimacy. All this is being noticed, right? It's not something that is hidden. It's all out in the open now. And it reminds me of a quote from a former leader in AIPAC, the pro-Israel lobby here in the United States, one of the most significant pro-Israel lobby organizations. Many years ago, this individual, Steve Rosen, was giving an interview to Jeffrey Goldberg, And one of the things that he said is the lobby is like a night flower. It thrives in the darkness and it withers in sunlight. And I think one of the things that's happening now more than ever before is that the lobby has been forced to come out into the sun. And all of the steps that it's taking and the efforts that it's making to support Israel's genocidal war in Gaza are happening in a way that's become impossible to ignore. And you touched on this a little bit, Bassam, as we closed out the last bit of our conversation before listening to these contributions, is that there's a changing conversation today. And one of the reasons there's a changing conversation today is because a lot of people, and you noted some of the folks that are on the right, that are not necessarily looking at this from a sort of a values-based perspective as those on the left or liberals would have concern about human rights or who would have concern about civil rights or so on. They're looking at it more from an America First perspective and more from an ethno-nationalist perspective. They can't quite wrap their heads around why the United States and America are making the kind of sacrifices that they're being asked to make to support this foreign country. And when they see, for example, people being arrested for writing op-eds, when they see, for example, people being fired from their jobs for things that they say or post, when they see that American tax dollars are being spent to effectively finance Israel's endless militarism against Palestinians, they don't understand why, and they object to this. And so, one of the things that's forcing this growing conversation today is because opinion is shifting. And to keep American policy as it is, supportive of Israel in the way that it is and to the extent that it is, the influence exerted to do so increasingly has to be done against the will of a growing number of people. And that means the lobby has to come out into the sun. That means AIPAC is no longer operating quietly. It has to register PACs that spend hundreds of millions of dollars openly for the first time on congressional elections, as we've seen in very recent cycles. It has to increasingly rely on repression because there's no longer a consensus around U.S. policy. There's growing dissent around U.S. policy towards Israel. And so we see all of these repressive measures being enacted, being sought after, whether it's by ICE or universities or employers or social media platforms. And people see this. People who don't necessarily care about Palestine or care about anywhere else in the world, they see this. And they understand it for the heavy-handed and absurd power play that it is, and they object to it. And so I think this is one of the other important things that were raised in a number of the comments here that are a reflection on this moment. And as you noted, the growing change in the conversation, and this is accelerating. And by the way, we are on pace for a continuation of this trend in an accelerated way for years to come. The impact of the last couple of years, I think, on American attitudes towards this issue is going to be unlike anything that we have seen previously. We can look at some historical examples of moments where really horrific Israeli violations of human rights for extended periods of time have helped shape opinion. And we see evidence of that from the 2006 war, Lebanon, the 2009 war on Gaza, the 2014 war on Gaza. All of these sort of have noticeable impacts on opinion over time. But what we are seeing now, both in terms of the level of violence and the duration of it, is absolutely unprecedented, and it is going to shape the views and opinions of an entire generation of Americans for a very, very long time. And so we are setting up for a dynamic where, to maintain pro-Israel positions, the lobby is going to not only have to continue to come out into the sun, but it's going to have to become more desperate in its efforts, which is only, I think, going to fuel this cycle of objection to what it is doing. I think we are seeing the stage being set for growing focus, growing criticism, growing objection to the role of pro-Israel influence in the United States from multiple directions. Direction from the left that is more values-based and objects to these policies and their impact on Palestinians, and objections from the right who don't understand why the United States is getting involved in this, why their money is being spent on these places, and why their constitutional rights are evaporating to protect a foreign country that is committing all of these crimes to begin with. So I'll sort of stop there, and perhaps we can discuss that.
Thanks, Yousef. I think we can talk about this in various aspects of it for hours, but I'm going to spare everyone and ask you a final question, because I think we will come back to this topic. Unfortunately, we will come back to everything about this genocide over and over because it's not stopping. So my interest personally is in, of course, the concept and how to introduce it and how to address it. But one way of like actually getting to the bottom of things is to look at the liberal Zionism aspect, or liberal Zionists, that category of people, or that sort of shade of the concept that distinguishes between different governments and Israel. These are people that we know, speak with all the time, those of us living in the United States and beyond. Those are folks who basically establish a firm distinction between Netanyahu and Israel, right? And say this is not an expression of what Israel is, or between the Likud and Israel. But then again, if you look at the history, some of the most repugnant acts of either war or killing or brutality, like, you know, breaking the bones of Palestinians, was something that the man of peace, former non-Likud minister, prime minister, was advocating. And this is, of course, just a a side example. There are many more concrete examples. So liberal Zionism is sort of like the CNN of American media. It's not Fox News, but CNN is also more representative of mainstream media in the United States and why it is problematic. So we don't have to go to Ben Gvir or Netanyahu or Smotrich to explain and understand Zionism. We could just understand Zionism by looking at the mainstream, by looking at the polls, the polls of Israelis today, because Israel is one of the most polled places in the world, apparently. And the polls actually reflect a congruence between what is happening in Gaza and what the overwhelming majority of Israelis, on some counts, are supportive of. So how do you tackle this question of liberal Zionists who are very offended, themselves offended at what Israel is doing today, but are unable to address the very real statements and conversations by early Zionists, or the dominant ones, that actually spoke of all the things that are happening today? Maybe they spoke of them in more, in different terms, sometimes in slow motion terms, and this is, of course, now happening in real time and in much faster pace, and so on. So how do you tackle the question of real liberal Zionism, or liberal Zionists, although we should make a distinction between them, and how they try to exculpate what's happening from what Israel or Zionism is? Is that too much?
No, not at all. I mean, to be honest with you, Bassam, I think this is a problem that's largely going to take care of itself on its own. I think there was a time where the liberal Zionist position was more sustainable. There was it was easier to be a liberal Zionist in the past. I think it was always wrong. I think it was always contradictory. Um, but it was easier in the past to hold the kind of views that liberal Zionists held. Um, you talked about Yitzhak Rabin and obviously the policies of different Israeli governments, regardless to whether they were labor or Likud in support of Zionism and its expansionism. But there was a certain romanticization of Zionist history that liberal Zionists clung to. A sort of an imaginary Israel that was not perfect, but was still pretty good, still upheld liberal values, still was democratic in nature, that attempted to make peace with the Palestinians, that wanted to be both Jewish and democratic. I don't think any of those things were ever really true. But it's so much harder today to pretend that any of those things are still possible, given all of the change that we've seen on the ground. Obviously, from the Palestinian perspective, there's Zionism. It doesn't really matter if it's right, left, liberal, conservative, whatever. To us, it's all the same thing. It's all aimed at our replacement, right? But for outsiders, there was a way to imagine in Israel, largely through ignoring a lot of the lived experience and realities of Palestinians, that allowed for liberal Zionism to sort of exist. I just don't see that as really possible here. And the people who are still attempting it are living in a place that's further and further from the reality, not just of the lived experiences of Palestinians, but the reality of what Israelis are saying and doing and continue to say and do, right? You have a Israel today that is very far to the right politically, openly speaking of horrific crimes against Palestinians, dominated by religious nationalists who have power that they've never had before in Israel. And they seek to shape the society in a way inside Israel, which also changes the reality for liberal Zionists. And we've seen that with some of the efforts to really rewrite law in Israel, not just to favor Jews, which has always been the case vis-a-vis Palestinians, but to favor a particular type of Jews within Israeli society. And so this idea that a Jewish democratic state is possible is being undercut by the very Zionists in Israel who are driving Israel in the direction of greater theocracy, right? And of course, one of the sort of primary myths upon which liberal Zionism rests is this idea that partition is possible and preferable for Israel, and that a two-state solution resolves this issue and allows for a Jewish and democratic state. But I mean, the Israelis have never been more opposed to partition than they are today. They not only are opposed to partition and Palestinian self-determination, they want to control all of the territory. They want to settle the territory. They increasingly claim it based on, religious grounds, with all the religious nationalists that now have power. And they increasingly, opinion polls show, want to force the expulsion of Palestinians from these territories. So what Israel are these liberal Zionists talking about? It's not an Israel that ever existed, and it's certainly not an Israel that exists today. And it's far less likely to be anything close to that moving forward, given all of the trends that we see. So, liberal Zionists, I think, increasingly will be, seen as people who do not want to acknowledge the reality on the ground, and increasingly treated as unserious people in liberal spaces moving forward.
Couldn't find the mute button. Thanks, Yousef. No, I do think exactly what you said about the difference between today and the basically the unsustainable arguments during genocides of liberal Zionists. But you speak with them and they they want to distance Israel from what's happening. You hear them. We know a lot of the folks that are livid about what's happening among liberal Zionists, but they see it as a diversion from what the project of Zionism is, whereas the founding fathers or the founding people who actually have on the record almost everything that Israel has been doing in terms of the necessity of replacing the people of the indigenous people before a lot of immigration took place from Europe, and that's way before the World War II or the Holocaust. And they spoke very plainly about how it's inescapable. I mean, forms of ethnic cleansing, some spoke of it in a way that said, it could be done in one way or another way, but it could be done in a gentler way, but it has to be done, whether it's Ben Gurion or others. And I'm talking about the moderate voices. I'm not talking about the voices that were very adamant about more, brutal ways in theory, even. Of course, in practice, things were quite brutal and violent and barbaric at times. And that's, I think, what a lot of people cannot get their head around. And it's very difficult to communicate that because there were some voices that tried to avoid the conflict, the actual realistic conflict that they would have to face in order to settle in Palestine, coming from Europe. And this avoidance is used as a way of saying, well, some did not actually speak of explicit ethnic cleansing. Well, that's because they didn't address the conflict properly. I mean, it's almost inevitable. And I think that's a very important conversation, at least with people who are willing to speak with you or me, or people who are critical of the behavior of the state of Israel since 48 and its interlocutors prior. So yeah, it's I hope we can get to that, because I think it's something that is worth discussing, and a lot of people are beginning to be open to this discussion in ways that they weren't before. Just like with capitalism in the United States, I remember speaking in the classroom in 2001, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 about capitalism in ways that made some students feel uncomfortable when some readings are assigned. But after the crash of 2008, it's not like people, turned from being capitalist to Marxist or socialist, but they were more open to talking. As we have seen, the needle hasn't moved very much on this, and I don't think it necessarily has to move. It will move very much on this other topic, but I think the conversations can be had, whether or not conversations lead somewhere. So with that, I wanted to ask if you have any closing comments because I know we're going to speak with you again. We're going to talk about this again. Any final comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just touch on one thing, since we're really talking about teaching. And there is an unprecedented attack today, as we've already discussed, on universities, specifically aimed at the teaching of Palestine. We are seeing the federal government here in the United States impose conditions on universities to effectively police the teaching of Palestine and the broader Middle East, but specifically Palestine, in a way that suits pro-Israel interests, and in a way that basically supports American policy. And we're hearing stories from universities left and right about professors who have had to modify their syllabi, or remove certain readings, or not use content that includes certain words in the titles, whether it's genocide or colonialism or what have you. And I think one of the most important ways to teach about Zionism and what it is and what it's meant is to read Zionists, frankly, across time and history. And it's very transparent and very educational to do that. And I think, at a time where the words of Palestinians are being, and the perspectives of Palestinians are being policed in the most unprecedented ways. Sometimes it's the words of Zionists themselves that are most revealing about what the intentions, attitudes, and decisions Zionists have made actually work. And so, in a course that I teach, I include a tremendous amount of material written by Zionists with Zionist perspectives over time, because I think they tell us what they think. And what is different today is that the lens through which people are viewing, reading, assessing the perspectives and the arguments of Zionists over time has become more critical. Previously, these arguments, I think, would have been accepted far less critically. But what has changed, I think, today is that there is a more critical assessment. So let them tell you who they are, and focus on the history, focus on their writings, focus on their intentions, because they make it very clear what the purpose is, what the concerns were, and who they were not concerned about, specifically the people that they sought to replace. So if I had a bit of advice for those seeking to teach about Zionism, it would be, let the Zionists do the talking in the course material historically, not the propagandists, but the historical material. It's actually very clear. The primary sources are very clear, very useful, and really should be part of any serious course on this issue.
And we're talking about mainstream folks, leaders that are quite legitimate in the sort of Zionist cosmos, right? We're not talking about the outliers. We're addressing the sort of the mainstream, and I'm assuming you're addressing the mainstream because there are varieties, and even the mainstream include in their work, in their sayings, in their writings, those things that you are and I was referring to, that basically, like I said, and like you said, speak for themselves in terms of the inevitability of basically everything that's been happening. Maybe they did not envision an intense genocide, but it was somewhat of a slow motion one.
Yeah, I think you need to obviously focus on the individuals that have power to shape outcomes. But there's also a range of voices among Zionists. Obviously, they all fall under that Zionist umbrella. But including also diverse perspectives among Zionists, I think, is important because it shows you what the range of acceptable opinion is. It shows you sort of what the arguments were, what the points of division were, and where ultimately they largely settled, what became the mainstream consensus around it. I think that tells you, I think, more about Zionism than almost anything.
You think we will get in trouble if we assign readings by Ben Gurion or Joseph Weitz or Jabotinsky and so on? We will be considered anti-Semitic?
You know what? Since so much of all of this has become just absurd, one cannot rule it out. But when you teach the Iron Wall, for example, one of the important pieces of Zionist argumentation written by Zev Jabotinsky in the around 1920. In his piece, he says, look, the Palestinians are the natives. Every native population resists, and our movement is akin to the settler colonialist movements, the ones that have removed the Native Americans in the United States, and we should expect fierce resistance from the native population. That's a Zionist perspective. It's a right-wing Zionist perspective. And it is a crucial historical document. But with some of the positions that these university administrators have been taking, one has to wonder: is even that going to be considered inappropriate for a classroom discussion because it touches on these themes? I think, though, it would only highlight the absurdity of these repressive measures if something like that was to happen. But these days, you never know.
Absolutely. Thanks, Yousef. And would it be possible to attach to the post under this episode just a list of a bouquet of readings that are considered primary sources? It would be great if you can furnish just a few readings that you feel are both representative and legitimate, so as not to be considered cherry picking, because frankly the most dominant ones are the most legitimate ones and are equally as problematic, if honest, but still problematic in terms of it.
There's a long list, Sam. I think, I'm happy to share plenty of links with you, but I do think it's important to read quite a range.
Yeah.
You come away with a very clear understanding, even from reading that wide range, including over time. But yes, happy to share tons of links to primary sources.
I appreciate it, Yousef. We kept you for too long. You had to watch this again while we did the recording, and I have nothing but gratitude for you coming on. This is, I think, your third time you join our Gaza in Context teaching or collaborative teaching project, and I hope you have a great day after this long conversation.
More than happy to do it, Bassam. I very much appreciate all the work you guys are doing on this.
Shukran, Habib. Salam.
Take care.